Ross's ethics and intuitionism. As we just saw, deontological theories reject consequences as a basis for morality and instead focus on duties that are characterized by principles regarding specific kinds of acts and often intentions. So Ross's theory sort of gives us the feeling of a deontological theory, although as we'll soon see, it may not technically speaking be a classic deontological theory, but it just kind of gets us moving in the right direction. So Ross offers us a straightforward moral theory that begins by identifying that there are at least 7 foundational moral duties. So Ross's 7 foundational moral duties include fidelity, and this is the duty to be truthful, pay back debts, and keep agreements. Reparation, this is the duty to set right any wrongs we've previously done to another person, for example, to apologize, pay for damages, and so on. Gratitude, this is the duty to make some return for favors and services others have done for us, for example, expressing thanks and acting similarly as needed, so on. Justice, this is the duty to ensure the fair distribution of goods according to merit. Beneficence, this is the duty to improve the conditions of others. Self-improvement, which is the duty to improve oneself. And non-malfeasance, which is the duty not to harm or injure others. So I'm sure that we can see as we kind of go through this list that Ross uses words that are a little bit different than maybe we would. We might not use words like fidelity. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't use beneficence, and probably not non-malfeasance. These are some strange words. The idea is, however, as we'll see, that some version of these ideas are foundational moral duties. So we don't have to use the same exact words that Ross does, but the idea is that these 7 moral duties sort of more or less, as we'll see, outline what is required of us morally. Now, a few notes. Each of these 7 constitute a binding moral duty, which is to say that each of these things that Ross has identified does lay out something that we need to do in particular situations. Each is an essential part of any adequate moral standard. So any adequate moral standard is going to, at minimum, involve these 7 things. But this is not to say that the list is necessarily complete. There may be other foundational moral duties. In addition, these duties are listed in no particular order, so it's not to say that the duty at the top of the list is more important than the duty at the bottom of the list. They're not in any particular order. However, not all of these moral duties are equal, okay? So they're not listed in a particular order, but they're also not equal. And we'll kind of get more into this in a moment. So, what's deontological about Ross's theory? I said early on that this isn't a classic example of a deontological ethical theory. It's just sort of, we might think, deontological adjacent. But each of Ross's duties specify a certain way we should act justly, for instance, with gratitude. Okay? And each duty thus functions as a general principle that prescribes certain kinds of acts. So following from the duty of non-malfeasance, for example, we have certain ways that we should act, namely in such a way that we don't hurt other people. All right. So if I have a choice between either speaking the truth or deliberately deceiving someone, I have a moral duty to tell the truth. And if I don't tell the truth, I violate my duty to commit a wrong. I violate my duty and commit a wrong. Doing right amounts to acting in ways that fulfill these general moral duties. Notice that Ross doesn't base his duties on their likely consequences. This is important. Our actions follow from our duties, not from the consequences of our actions. Although fulfilling Ross's duties would probably promote utility in most cases, Ross doesn't think that moral duties depend on what happens after we act. right? What matters is the duty that we're acting to try to uphold, not what happens after our actions. It's more correct to think of each duty as resting upon something that already holds true before we act, right? So the duty follows from something that's true before we act, and then we try to act in accordance with the duty. Now, what happens when we are faced with a situation where two duties conflict with each other? So, what Ross says here is that we have a prima facie duty, and this is one that we ought to fulfill as long as no more important duty overrides it. Yet, when moral duties conflict, one usually turns out to be more important than the others. The more important duty of the two then becomes my actual moral duty. So when two moral duties conflict, there's the prima facie duty, and then there's my actual moral duty. And the actual moral duty is the one that seems to be the most important. Now, we may be wondering here, and as you've listened to this presentation, you might think, it seems like you're using pretty loose language here. Yeah, and one question that comes up is, how do we determine which duty is most important in a given situation? And what is it that supports Ross's moral duties in the first place? This is kind of a weird theory. And here is where we get to what supports Ross's moral duties and what it is that determines what duty it is that's most important in any particular situation. It's something called Intuitionism. So, Intuitionism says that just as mature and thoughtful people can just see that 2 and 2 make 4, sincere and thoughtful people can see that we ought to keep our promises, for example, to help others and not hurt them, and so on. We simply must carefully and honestly consult our inner selves, our intuitions. We don't discover moral duties by observing consequences or by reasoning. We just know them intuitively. They're just inside of us. Similarly, we can know which duty is the most important in any given situation just by following our intuition about what is most important. And this leads us to the definition of Intuitionism. This is the view that we simply know by intuition what our general moral duties are, with no further explanation. Now, Ross's intuitionist theory is not subjectivist. We might think that it is, because it seems like each of our moral duties could be different, thus making the view subjectivist. However, because each moral duty holds for everyone, Ross's theory is an example of an objectivist moral theory. If someone claims that she doesn't see herself having a duty of beneficence or perhaps self-improvement, Ross would just say that she's wrong. Perhaps she's not being sincere, or maybe her moral intuitions have not fully matured. But each duty holds for everyone. So basically how Ross sees this is that by being in the world and by reflecting and reasoning correctly, we're all going to come up with roughly the same moral duties, and that following these is what's right and wrong. So although it seems like it should be subjectivist, it's not. It actually turns out being an objectivist theory. So as I could imagine, we think there are some problems with Ross's theory. One problem is that even if Ross's intuitionism is correct regarding how we come to know moral truths, it tells us nothing about what makes things morally right or wrong, right? This is to say that it lacks explanatory power. If we think about the introduction to part 2 of this class that goes over what moral theories, what characteristics they should have, one of them was explanatory power, and it seems like Ross's theory lacks this. It also raises worries with practicability because there's always going to be some disagreement between different people's moral intuitions. You'll notice this in the way that I just framed what's going on when we figure out what our moral intuitions are, right? We just exist in the world and we think and we reflect, and most people are going to come up with fairly similar sets, right? Fairly similar sets of intuitions, but there's going to always be some disagreement between moral intuitions, and it's unclear how it is we're supposed to solve this on Ross's view. In fact, we aren't always even sure about our own intuitions. I'm sure that we could think about times when we're just not sure what to do, and our intuitions aren't a good guide. Further, even our most sincerely held moral intuitions are vulnerable to social influences. This is to say that our intuitions can often follow from what's going on around us. For instance, many good people have practiced polygamy, although the moral intuitions of most Americans condemn the practice. We'll remember here that polygamy is the act of having more than one husband or wife. Intuition doesn't seem to have a very firm basis for discerning moral truth when it comes down to it. Now, notice how this interacts with what we often think, right? If we're reflecting on why we know something's right, often something that we'll say is, I just feel like it's right. I just feel like I know that it's right. So when we have that thought about our moral beliefs in our minds, let's think about Ross's theory and some of the challenges with it.